Hello, everybody. I'm Nate Coulter from the Central Arkansas Library System, and today I'm visiting with my friend John Kirk, who's the Donaghy Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Arkansas Little Rock. John, welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me along.
You're familiar with a lot of spaces around the library. I know you've done a lot of work at the UA Little Rock Center for Arkansas History and Culture, and it's across the street in one of our buildings. And you're a very big consumer of archival material over there, I know, because you have been around a lot. You took 12 years to research and write this book, which is what we're primarily talking about today in advance of your presentation at the Six Bridges Book Festival the library hosts annually. The dates for that are October 20th through 30th, and we appreciate your doing that, and even more so appreciate your 12 years of devotion to writing this biography of the late Governor Winthrop Rockefeller. Why don't you tell us a little bit about? Let me also add that this is not the only book you've written, right? You're the author and editor of 10 other books, and you seem to have had a focus on Arkansas. The two included in the book jacket are The Origins and Legacies of the Central High Crisis and Race and Ethnicity in Arkansas, New Perspectives. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you wound up being an Arkansas-focused scholar?
Yeah, it's a long story to the Rockefeller book. I did my education in the United Kingdom. I did my undergraduate degree in American Studies at the University of Nottingham. And in my final year there, I wrote a thesis on William Faulkner and race, and that kind of got me interested in race relations. And then I was looking around for a PhD program, or more like a supervisor in the UK. It was by a particular person. And one of the top civil rights scholars was a guy called Tony Badger, who was at the University of Newcastle on Tyne. And I went up to visit him, and they had a scholarship up there, and he was one of the top people in the field. And he was working on a project on white Southern governors and the civil rights movement at the time. And he was looking at Sid McMath, and he bought in the Arkansas Gazette on microfilm to look at there. And so we discussed a number of topics, and I decided that I'd work on a history of the long civil rights movement in Little Rock, putting the 1957 school crisis and its longer perspective, and spent a year in Newcastle, spent a year here in Little Rock from 92 to 93, summer 92 to 93, just when Bill Clinton was running for president for the first time. And that
Fairly
was a
vibrant time to be in Arkansas.
It was a great time to be here and around, and did lots of research, spoke to a lot of people, got the first book done, and then kind of wrote books on the civil rights movement nationally and with an Arkansas focus. And along the way, found out about Winthrop Rockefeller, and that kind of leads to the Rockefeller book.
You note in the book early on that there have been other biographies, other biographers have tackled Rockefeller. It seems like, and you tell me, correct me if I'm wrong, that part of what drew you to add to that volume or add to those books about Rockefeller was your distinct impression that they had, maybe this is an Arkansas-centric bias, they skipped over the first two-thirds of his life before he came to Arkansas in 1953. I think you note that one of the biographies of Rockefeller devotes a full page and a half out of about 206 pages in the book to his period of time spent in New York. Tell us more about your sense of how that historiography worked and why you got interested in focusing in this volume. I guess, and I would infer there might be other volumes, but at least this one is subtitled From New Yorker to Arkansas, Year 1912 to 1956.
Yeah, it's the part of the story that really hasn't been written about in Winthrop Rockefeller's life. And, you know, it's kind of focused on Arkansas and his move to the state after 1953. And two of the three books that have been written on Rockefeller are by John Ward, who was a journalist by training and also was Rockefeller's public relations guy too. So there's a very particular perspective on Rockefeller, and it's kind of an insider look from a journalistic perspective. And two great books to start from. And there's another book that was a PhD thesis turned into a book that looks really at Rockefeller as governor of Arkansas and his legislative achievements. But it seems that we kind of view Winthrop Rockefeller's life backwards. That, you know, we start with his life and term as governor, which came right at the end of his life, and then we look backwards to what came before that in Arkansas. But nobody had really looked further beyond that to his early life and the first two-thirds of his life and how he came to the state in the first place. And it struck me that that was really important context for understanding what happened in the second half of his life. So in some ways, the book is an attempt to sort of recontextualize Rockefeller's Arkansas life within the context of his early life and lay the groundwork for maybe going on to think more about how that impacts the way that we should view Rockefeller and his relationship with Arkansas afterwards.
He moved here, I guess, when he was 41, 42?
Yeah, around that 40s.
And so very few of us would probably believe that things that had happened in the first 40 or so years of our life had not affected where we went from there. So it's kind of a significant omission, I guess, to not put it in context and figure out what happened in the first 40 years of his life to understand what happened when he got here. You mentioned John Ward having been a journalist by trade and then worked for the governor. I'm interested in how hard it is to avoid falling into the trap of infatuation, might be too strong a word, or not the Parson Weems school of glorifying your subjects in biographies. But it would be hard not to have some sort of affection for someone you'd spent 12 years researching and writing about. How do you deal with that as a biographer?
Yeah, I think, you have sympathies with, or empathy at least, with the person that you're writing about. One of the things that I did with the book was to go back to the documentary record and have this as very much an archival-based book. And I think that's important to do. John's insider accounts were really mostly based on his own personal sort of feelings and experiences with Rockefeller, and kind of had a few sources to kind of back them up. But this is a really deep dive into the archives, looking page by page, as Robert Carroll says, turn every page. And, looking page by page, a huge, extensive collection that's housed down here in downtown Little Rock, the Rockefeller Papers. And really this is the first book that really goes into those papers and has a deep dive in terms of the early work on Rockefeller. And I think that's one way to do it, to kind of stay fixated on the documentary record and what that tells you, and what the contemporary records tell you. And I think, it's easier to do that as an outsider, and that's always been one of my strengths, I think, in looking at Arkansas history, because I look at it from an outsider's perspective rather than an insider's perspective, and I think that's different, and that gives you a kind of distance that allows you to write more sort of history that has a bigger, larger, wider perspective to it.
More objectivity. Yeah, I love that line in Carroll's little memoir about his editor, I think, in New Jersey, when he got out of Princeton, taught him that to be an investigative journalist, you have to turn every page. I think the instruction was turn every goddamn page, or something like that. And Carroll says when he got to Austin and first looked at the LBJ archival material down there, he realized he was not going to be able to turn every page, as it was almost, miles of 40-foot tall stacks of documents and records. But I suspect you did turn most every page that we have in Little Rock, and then I think you did some work in New York with archival material there. But let's talk a minute, if you would. Help us understand what you did use with some detail. I guess I was interested in your reference to this, I guess it was an interview for hire that Rockefeller commissioned David Camelon, is that how you pronounce his name?
I think so.
To create an extensive interview of him that ended up sort of ending at the point of Rockefeller's enlisting in the Army. But you didn't rely a great deal on that piece of material, or tell us how that fit into the primary sources that you did use. What use did you make of Camelon's interview of Rockefeller in I guess it was in the
late
early
40s.
50s?
Yeah, late 40s, early 50s. Yeah, Letter to My Son, as it became called, this manuscript, has kind of been the bedrock of everything we understand about Rockefeller's life before he came to Arkansas. And I kind of unraveled the puzzle surrounding that, because it's a book that came out under Rockefeller's name and had a limited release. It was released in leather-bound copies and distributed around the family. And when Paul Rockefeller, Winthrop's son, got a copy on his 21st birthday. And the manuscript kind of is told with Rockefeller's voice and starts from his birth up until the time he enrolled in the Army in 1941, at the beginning of the Second World War. And that's really kind of been the foundation for how we understand Rockefeller. And a lot of it covers his time in the oil industry. And so that's become a kind of focal point of Rockefeller's early life. But in the archives, and again, it comes back to turning every page and finding out what's in there. I found the original oral history manuscripts upon which the book was based. I discovered that, in fact, the book was never intended to end at the beginning of the Second World War, and that, in fact, there's a whole lot more to it that covers his role in the Second World War up to the time he moved to Arkansas. And in Rockefeller's own personal estimation, that was the pivotal point of his life and the most important part of his life that had never been written about before, and by accident had been kind of left out of this book, in part because Camelon died halfway through the project, and it was around the time that Rockefeller moved to Arkansas, so it all kind of got dropped, and the book ended up just being the kind of up to the Second World War rather than the longer version that he wanted. So in many ways, I could go back to the original source material for To My Son and write it more faithfully and cover Rockefeller's life more faithfully in the way that he wanted it written than it actually got published in the first place. So that was a neat thing to do and a great find in the archives to base this book upon.
So the actual recordings are there, but it's just the author of this, I guess it was a letter to Winpal was the way it was crafted.
The way it was ultimately kind of framed, yeah. At the time, it was just an interview between Camelon and Rockefeller and a couple of his best friends from his wartime experiences, Frank Newell, who was from here in Little Rock, and Graham Hawkes, who was his best friend in the military.
So Camelon actually had recorded these interviews, but just didn't get portions of his war involvement reduced into the writing.
Right, didn't make the final cut, didn't make the final manuscript when they kind of leather bound it, and they took it as far as the Second World War and finished there, and so left out a huge portion of the oral history and the rich amount of information that it covers.
You cover, I guess, in 2 or 3 chapters his period of time in the oil fields in the Southwest, but you do spend a lot of time, at least that much or more time in the book on his military record. He was in the Pacific Campaign. He enlisted, right, in the Army?
That's right, enlisted in January 1941.
Right.
So early on, before the United States had even entered the Second World War, before Pearl Harbor, 12 months before Pearl Harbor. So yeah, he volunteered and went into the service.
And he was in the Pacific Theater. But tell us a little bit about his involvement in Guam and Leyte Gulf, I guess, and Okinawa. He was in significant places in '44, I guess. So tell us what you think what his role was and what you think the significance of that part of his life was.
Yeah, well, he was a foot soldier in the war and, saw combat and was in those campaigns and had his boots on the ground. And was very different.
Unlike his brothers, I guess.
Unlike his brothers, yeah, I was going to say, it's very different. They mostly had desk jobs. David worked overseas in intelligence, but he was the only infantry soldier, and he wanted to do that. He volunteered to go out of the brothers because he said, the Rockefellers benefit from American democracy more than any other family does, perhaps, and one of us should be on the ground and fighting this war. And he was the only one who wasn't married at the time and didn't have children. So he said, it's my duty, I ought to go. And they backed him and said, okay, you go then. And he did. And he enlisted and, crisscrossed the country in training from coast to coast and rose through the ranks, and then went overseas and fought in 3 pivotal campaigns, and in the end, kind of ended up narrowly escaping with his life after his after his transport ship, the Enrico, was bombed in April 1945. So 44. It was a significant time for him, and later on he would refer to it as the most important, period of his life.
It's interesting that his siblings backed him when he decided to be the one who would go to combat or enlist and be in the ground infantry. I was struck by how much they bullied him in your portrayal, that they treated him badly as a child, made fun of him and sort of isolated him. To what do you attribute that? Was it birth order or differences in their ages, or what was the reason? It came across very strong to me that they treated him poorly.
Yeah, I think it was a very important forming part of his life. I think part of it was birth order. It was very much a seniority process, and the eldest in the family was a woman, Abby, who
it's pretty evident they treated her
right
worse. I think you indicated she received a much smaller share of their father's wealth
than any of them.
Any of the
Yeah,
sons.
and she was marginalized from the
Yes.
beginning because she was the one woman in what became known as the brothers' generation of the
Yes, it was
family.
painfully evident that the attitude about women in the early 20th century, and at least in that family, and I suspect that was indicative of a lot of families, was it was a caste system, clearly.
Right. And then the eldest brother was the kind of person that, as it went in the Rockefeller family, he was the patrician who became the kind of, inherited the name. He was John D. Rockefeller III, and he was immediately kind of selected as the leader of the family and kind of governed over the other boys. Then there was Nelson, of course, who probably became the most famous of the brothers as governor of New York.
I hadn't realized until I read your book that he was governor for over 12 years.
Yeah. And then vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford.
Right.
So he was the family politician, and he always tried hard to sort of be the number one child, although he could never, of course, be the firstborn male in the family. The kind of biology defeated him, but he did everything he could to try and fulfill that role. And then there was Lawrence, who came after him, and he was a kind of wily businessman, and they were two fast friends, Nelson and Lawrence. And then came Winthrop, and he was the fourth son, and struggled hard to fit in. David came afterwards, and he was the baby of the family. So Winthrop was kind of left stranded in the middle between being the baby of the family and wanting to be one of the older boys, but never kind of quite making it into that realm. And the other two, Nelson and Lawrence, kind of mercilessly bullied him as a child growing up. And that kind of set Winthrop off from an early age, I think, on a different sort of path to the others. And he became quite alienated from the family, and he looked for, friendship elsewhere outside of the family. And it's quite striking that he grew up a lot of the time playing with the groundspeople, the children of the groundspeople in the nearby town where his grandfather lived, up in Kycut, up in Westchester County, up in Sleepy Hollow. And he kind of from an early age developed a kind of life outside of the family and made contacts and made much larger friendships beyond the sort of small world of the Rockefellers and the kind of life that they lived. And I think that sort of was an important trajectory, an important path, because he ended up doing things that his brothers would never do, and being around people and being able to mix with people and make contacts with people that his brothers, would never be able to kind of mix with. So from an early age, I think that set a trajectory for Rockefeller that proved very important for the rest of his life.
You noted in comparing his life to those of the more high-profile brothers that some biographer had said that if he'd known how exciting and multifaceted Winthrop's life was, he should have written about Winthrop and forgotten the others, because it was a lot more tumultuous and maybe a lot more entertaining or interesting, deeper.
Right.
So that was, I guess, something that not very many people know.
Yeah, I think, he led the more exciting and swashbuckling life of the Rockefellers, and, they were kind of mainly desk people or politicians or had their mind set on, kind of ruling the world, whereas Winthrop was much more of a free spirit and much more willing to kind of, do things that they would never do and explore the world and explore other people and explore other places that they would never have gotten to. So he was certainly, the kind of more interesting, I think, in terms of his life story of the Rockefeller brothers, and the one who broke the mold and went furthest out of the family orbit and the usual narrative of who the Rockefellers are and what they were.
One of the things that I think was clearly evident in his tenure in Arkansas that as I indicated, is not really the focus of this book, but I think is relevant to what you've been talking about, is his enlightened attitude about race. It seems clear that he was someone in his cohort group or in that period of time who had a more enlightened or more progressive view about race. Perhaps that came from his being treated as an outsider by his older three brothers. What do you think what forged his attitudes about race that seemed, by all accounts, not just your book, but most accounts, evident in his governing Arkansas and other parts of his life?
Yeah, I think that marginalization kind of interestingly gave him kind of identification with the other marginalized people and people who've been sidelined. I think that played a role in it. Of course, the family itself had quite a long history of engagement with race relations. It's said that his grandfather, John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s first act of philanthropy, in what turned out to be a very prodigious career of philanthropy, was giving money to an African-American man so that he could free his wife from slavery. And they were Northern Baptists, steadfast abolitionists during the war.
Yes.
And on his grandmother's side, the Spellmans were kind of active in the Underground Railroad. And of course, Spelman College in the United States, in Atlanta, is still today one of the premier African-American liberal arts colleges for women. And it's Rockefeller's grandmother that gives her name to that college. So there's a strong link there. And, the philanthropic foundations built many African-American schools in the South and, worked on African-American projects. His father was very much into African-American colleges and supporting African-American colleges. So there's a strong background there. And, we often think about, from an Arkansas-centric view of Winthrop being involved in race relations, all those kinds of things. But I think one of the useful things that the book does in race and a lot of other ways is to provide context for that and to show that actually that wasn't just a kind of knee-jerk commitment because the civil rights movement was happening in the 1960s and that's when he happened to be running for governor. He was pretty heavily invested in civil rights and race relations long before he came to Arkansas. And notably, his work with the National Urban League, which is one of the big six civil rights organizations in the 1960s, and he was very heavily involved with them after the Second World War, and even to the extent of giving the money for them to buy a new headquarters in Manhattan, and made a substantial donation to them, and he put a lot of his time into the organization as well. He became the face of post-war National Urban League in Manhattan and throughout the United States. So he viewed himself in that post-Second World War era as the family spokesperson on race relations and, told reporters that and very much viewed himself in that way. So he had a very kind of long standard. Yes. Absolutely.
So one of the things about the book that I guess addresses some of the tragedies of his life, you pretty openly discuss the probability that he suffered from dyslexia, which made his academic performance wanting, both in high school. I guess he switched high schools at some point, had trouble matriculating maybe at both, and then he got in. It seemed like it was by the skin of his teeth to Yale, and I think by the end of his sophomore year was out. He was never diagnosed, I guess, with dyslexia, but that was not unusual for that period of time. But do you have any doubts that he suffered from some sort of learning disability?
Seems pretty certain. I think John Ward kind of hints in his book that he was eventually diagnosed with dyslexia as an adult. But it seems, it's fascinating to read the documents and look at the teachers and, look at them trying to figure out what's going on with Winthrop, because he's obviously intelligent, he's obviously bright, but his work doesn't reflect that. And he has really struggles to kind of digest words off of the written page and translate those, which is, a sign of dyslexia. And they just didn't really have the vocabulary or the knowledge at the time to understand the source of those difficulties that he was having in class. And, they all reverted back to the standard left-handedness, yes. Right? Yeah, it's because he's left-handed that he's slow and all those kinds of things and all those kinds of stereotypes, which of course we know more and better about now. But it really hindered him at the time, and they couldn't really figure out why, his classroom work and his grades were so poor, given, how bright and intelligent he seemed in class and around everybody else. He really struggled with that and struggled throughout his life as well. John Ward relates that later on, when he was at Winrock Farms up on Pettigene Mountain, he set up a literacy school for his workers there, and he tried to learn alongside them and still struggled to learn. It was a lifelong affliction, and, definitely helped also to shape his life and the things that he could do and the things that he couldn't do.
Again, created a source of empathy for him, I guess, among people who may be struggling. Did I take away that maybe perhaps two of the other brothers may have been dyslexic?
Yeah, Nelson and David were both dyslexic too, and curiously both left-handed too. They were two left-handed brothers as well, so they had the same kind of things put on them. I think it's difficult to kind of get to grips with dyslexia. I think we're still getting to grips with it as a learning disorder, and it affects different people in different ways with different kind of realms of severity. But clearly Winthrop suffered the most from it and, struggled the most at school and was the only one of the brothers who didn't actually graduate from university. He dropped out of Yale in February 1934 to go work in a more practical way at the oil fields and go out and work in Texas and take that kind of route instead.
You also deal pretty directly with the issues about his alcohol abuse, and I think you cite his brother David, who said he was a chronic alcoholic at the time of his death. And perhaps that interview, was that the interview with David? It was very late in his life, maybe as recently as 2017. Is that?
That's right, 2015.
2015.
Yeah, 2015 I interviewed David, who at the time was the world's oldest billionaire, which is a great title to have. He passed away just a couple of years later, so I was really glad that I got to interview him. He's one of the very few people then at the time alive who had a direct connection to Winthrop's early life, and was there to see all these things and view it from a first-hand perspective. So it was great to catch him. He was 101 years old at the time when I interviewed him. So, but he still was very sharp and had a good memory of those times. And in fact, the further back we went, the sharper his memory got, which is curious too. But it was great to have him on board.
But you cite him as one of the people who believed that Rockefeller suffered from alcoholism, and I guess that was not an unusual or not an unorthodox view at the time.
Yeah, I don't think it's any secret. I mean, it was an open secret when he was governor that, he struggled with issues of alcohol. It's always difficult as a biographer to kind of deal with that and figure out, how that works and how much you should take it into account, because, I think it changed over time, and, it's clearly documented that from his time in Yale when he started drinking, and, he came from a teetotal family.
They were all prohibitionists.
Right, yeah. His father in particular was very much against drink and tried to bribe them to stop them from drinking and smoking, with money, and he often used money as a leverage over his children. But
I did like, by the way, how you would always tell us in the book what those dollars that they were offering them in the 20s or 30s or 40s would convert to in inflation-adjusted dollars for 2020.
Yeah, and it gives you a better insight, I think, into just how much money we were talking about. Yeah, it's changed dramatically over the times. But Winthrop struggled with his drinking, over the course of his lifetime in different ways, in different forms at different times, I think. But my sense is that it became more and more difficult towards the end of his life, particularly with the pressures of being governor and the kind of day-to-day pressures that involved. But it's very difficult to parse that out, precisely what role it plays at different points in his life. It's one of the things that biographers always struggle with.
The book ends with his coming to Arkansas in the midst of what I think is safe to call a very contentious divorce. At least his wife was seeking to make it a high-profile drama, and the media in New York and other places perhaps took advantage of that. And he came to Arkansas, and I guess there were allegations, you deal with this, or I think you describe cynics who said, well, maybe one of the reasons he came to Arkansas was because it had very relatively liberal divorce laws. Mm-hmm. And you note that Rockefeller's response to questions about that at the time were, I think you described them as somewhat ambiguous. Why did he come to Arkansas?
Yeah, well, I think that's, not one of the ongoing myths about why Winthrop came to the state is because of the liberal divorce laws, and you just came here seeking a divorce. And one of the interesting things about that is, of course, that Arkansas did have more liberal divorce laws than New York at the time, which is kind of fascinating in its own right. But as
not
the book,
as liberal as Nevada, I guess.
Right. Well, I think as liberal, but not as attractive a place to visit for the high rollers as Nevada was. And that's the thing, as the book kind of makes clear. All the high rollers, all the high-profile people in the United States went to Nevada and went to stay in Reno or Las Vegas while they kind of had their residency and got a quick divorce there. And that's where
Bobo went at the time.
And that's where Bobo went, and that's where they eventually got divorced. Actually, she went for the second time to get a second divorce to Nevada. That's where you would have gone. So although it's true about Arkansas's liberal divorce laws, they ended up in the end getting divorced in Nevada, and that's where everybody went. So it wasn't just that. Certainly, the divorce kind of was a push to get out of New York, and he was wanting to avoid all those headlines, and it was constantly in the press.
The brothers were meeting regularly and calling it Winthrop's problem, Winthrop's separation, Winthrop's divorce.
Yeah, and the Rockefellers were a really secretive, private family, and they hated that kind of publicity, and it was in the press all the time. And of course, his wife, Barbara Sears, or Bobo, as she was more popularly known, wanted to keep it in the press because that was her leverage to kind of to get a bigger settlement as possible. And so he eventually kind of was pushed out of New York because of that, and he wanted to go somewhere else. But the pull factor really was his friend Frank Newell, who's an insurance broker here in Little Rock, and who he'd met in the war and who he'd served alongside, and was one of his two best friends in the military. And I think, he kind of looked up to Frank as a older brother, perhaps a better older brother than the ones he'd actually had as a surrogate older brother, and really liked him and looked up to him. And the family liked him as well. Rockefeller's mother, Abby, really liked Frank and used to talk about Russian literature with him, and she would send, him books on the front lines when he was in the war too. And Frank, said, "You should come here. It's a great place." He told him about Arkansas throughout the Second World War. And, Winthrop wanted a place to escape to, and he had the means and resources to go pretty much anywhere in the world he wanted to. But,
it's sometimes in Venezuela during the divorce.
Yeah, it's
right?
spent some time in Venezuela. And he was an international jet setter, been in the Middle East, working with the oil industry and all those kinds of things. So he'd been around the world. He could have gone anywhere, but he came to Little Rock because of Frank Newell, and Frank sold him on this land on top of Pettigene Mountain, which was one of his favorite places to go to. And, he bought land up on there, built a farm, and the rest, as they say, is history. It's still there today, and that's where he spent the rest of his life, is his kind of anchor and home base on Windrock Farms up on Pettigene Mountain in kind of rural Arkansas. And so that was a pivotal turning point and decision in his life.
Although he landed initially, I didn't know this until your book. He was staying in the penthouse suite of the Sam Peck Hotel across from the federal courthouse on Capitol Avenue when he first got to Arkansas. And
that's right.
I guess Frank knew about the land in Pettigene and introduced that to him, showed him that?
Yeah, showed him that and said, I think you'll like this place. It's the place I love to come with my family. And, it's much wilder and remoter then. And Winthrop kind of tamed the top of the mountain and turned it into these green pastures by spending millions of dollars to get water up the hill from the Arkansas River and, turn it into a model farm up there. So he transformed the place. But, Frank really loved it, and he sold him on it. Winthrop bought it and, set up stall in Arkansas pretty quickly after that.
One other thing I learned, this is probably on the certainly on the less substantive side, but it was interesting. You recount how Time magazine labeled something in the middle of the divorce, the Battle of Windrock. Tell us about the Battle of Windrock.
Yeah, that was soon after Winthrop kind of started setting up Windrock Farms. And, of course, one of the things that was a point of contention after the divorce was custody of Win Paul Rockefeller, who was his only son. And, he would stay with Winthrop on Pettigene for holidays. And he came for one holiday, and there was still ongoing friction between him and his ex-wife, Bobo. And she sent a nurse with her son, and Winthrop didn't approve of the nurse, and she wasn't a registered nurse, and there was all kinds of disagreements about that. He fired the nurse. And when he did that, Bobo turned up on his doorstep and tried to kind of grab Win Paul from the top of the mountain. And Gene Smith, who was from the Little Rock Police, who was off duty, and hired for the summers to be the bodyguard for Win Paul, dealt with things up there and ended up, in an altercation with Bobo, and eventually Marlon Hawkins came up from Conway County.
Marlon Hawkins, given the later history.
Right, came up and arrested her and her colleagues, and and diffused the situation. And she went back to New York, threatening to sue, but never did. And that was kind of the last major public spat between the two that appeared in the press.
So let's end on a more substantive and thoughtful note. Why do you think this man was so consequential, given all these things that happened to him in the first 40 years of his life? Why was he such a consequential figure in Arkansas's future?
Yeah, I think, his governorship was a crucial period of transition. And we know a lot about the Little Rock school crisis and Governor Orville Forbes being in charge and, his 6 terms in office. And then we know a lot about Bill Clinton becoming president of the United States. And, Diane Blair's written about the big 3 bumpers, Pryor and Clinton, and how that story falls. But Rockefeller's often the absent voice in the middle of all that. And he was the fundamental, pivotal point of transition between Forbes and Clinton, who really transformed the state's politics, really ended that kind of old guard segregationist voice in the Democratic Party and silenced that and paved the way for a new, more liberal more progressive strand of Democratic politicians to come through. So, it was really pivotal, a crucial time in Arkansas history, when civil rights and black power at their utmost, when Vietnam, all those kinds of things were happening in the nation. He kind of steered Arkansas through that transition and really was a transformative governor, and played a pivotal role in that sense. And I think, we've very much overlooked that, and it's been an oversight that needs to be re-examined and corrected, and we need to understand that, how we got from Forbes to Clinton. And Rockefeller, I think, is very much the missing part of that story.
Yeah, he was clearly the catalyst for that transition, and maybe eventually, but it happened when it happened. I would contend because of Rockefeller. Otherwise, you wouldn't have seen bumpers Pryor and Clinton. There was a McMath interlude of some progressive. McMath was a supporter of Truman and not the Dixiecrats in 1948. So McMath was progressive in a way. But right. The Faubus stranglehold on the state was still enormous, and that was why it took someone like Rockefeller, I guess, to turn that tide.
Yeah, and the first Republican governor in 94 years. I mean, that's a long time to have a state ruled by the Democratic Party and one-party politics. And, of course, Winthrop was very much against that kind of notion of one-party politics, and he wanted to introduce a two-party system into the state because he was a capitalist through and through, and he believed in the free market economics, but he also believed in the free market politics
Voters
too.
Should have choices.
And he said, the only way to have a healthy democracy is to have a competitive two-party system. And, funnily enough, later on he wrote that if he'd have come to Arkansas and had been dominated by the Republican Party, he would have run as a Democrat instead. So, he just wanted to see two-party politics. He wanted to see viable competition and viable alternatives for the state to choose from. The essence of democracy is people having a choice, of course.
Well, thank you again for writing this book, and thank you for presenting at the Six Bridges Book Festival for the library's readers and people in the community. And I guess I would imagine it might be a possibility that you will squeeze in amongst all the other things you do at the university and all your other scholarship that there will be a second volume of following up on the period of Rockefeller's governorship in Arkansas years, I guess, when he was the head of AIDC, it was called at the time, I guess.
Yeah, it'd be great to do that and write the kind of Arkansas companion volume to this. I think, it's amazing how much interest there's been in the book and how popular it's been and how much of a reservoir still of support and heartfelt warmth there is for Rockefeller, and that's been evident in the feedback I've got from the book. I think there's a lot of demand. People ask me all the time, are you going to write the second volume to kind of fill in the story from what he did next in Arkansas? And so that's definitely one of the things on the horizon to work on next, what Winthrop did next.
It's easy for those of us to sit on the sidelines and urge you to do it, but you're the one who has to spend the 12. Maybe it won't take 12 years to do the Arkansas period.
Well, let's hope not. I like to get it finished sooner than that. And of course, I've done a lot of other things in the meantime while I've been writing this book. So hopefully I can get it done sooner rather than later. But as you said,
it was really only a third of his life, I guess. So if you spent 12 years on the first 2/3 of his life, maybe the last third would be half that.
Yeah, although a lot happened in that final third. Of course, became governor and did a lot of other things, and it was kind of the burgeoning of his kind of public and political life. So there's a whole lot more of the Rockefeller papers there. I probably only scratched 20% of the entire collection.
Got to turn
right
every
in
page.
This book. So there's a lot more to keep going at.
Are most of those primary sources in Arkansas?
Yeah, the Winthrop Rockefeller collection is here downtown. In the Center for Arkansas History and Culture, Butler Center Archive, Bobby Roberts Library just across the road from here. They're all there. All the boxes are there, and I've made my way through about 20% of them. Still got 80% to go. So
we'll keep the coffee on and keep the lights on. So I look forward to seeing you in the research room when that comes about.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks again, John. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me along.